Morning, everyone. Right, the reading is from Psalms 105, verses 1 to 7. Okay. Give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, make known among the nations what he has done. Sing to him, sing praise to him, tell of all his wonderful acts. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Look to the Lord and his strength. Seek his face always. Remember the wonders he has done, his miracles, and the judgments he pronounced. O descendants of Abraham, his servant, O sons of Jacob, his chosen ones. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. Amen.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Very nice to see you all, and beautiful weather again today, isn't it? So David must have been praying hard, which is good to see. King David, yes. But I hope you've been enjoying the festival. We certainly have enjoyed it very much. Thank you for the special music. Always adds so much to the service. I'm only sorry not to be able to see the presentation on the temple in just a couple of days' time. So I hope you've got that in your diary. That looks really very exciting to come along and see. Well, if you were to describe God in one word, what would you use? Some might describe God as being sovereign. Some might describe God as being holy. Some may say that, well, he is almighty. And of course, all of those descriptions of God are perfectly true. But the Apostle John, in his first epistle, chose the word love to describe God. Now, in saying that God is love, John is not saying that this is just one characteristic among many other characteristics of God. Love is not something that God does. Love is something that God is. Or better still, love is who God is. And today we're going to have a look at a psalm about the steadfast and unfailing love of God. So turn over to Psalm 107. Psalm 107. The whole theme of this psalm is about God's love. But I want us to look, first of all, right at the end of the psalm, in verse 43. Psalm 107 and verse 43. And the psalmist says, "Whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. Let them consider the steadfast love of the Lord." And I wonder, have you ever considered the love of God? The word consider here means to puzzle. It means to stare. It means to ponder. It means to figure out. You know, have you ever looked over in the distance and saw something and you just think, well, what is that? And you've just stood there staring, just trying to work it out, puzzling what it might be. That's what the psalmist is asking us to do with the love of God. The psalmist is saying, unless you have looked at the love of God to the point where it makes you puzzle, to the point where you see the very richness of God's love, if the love of God has never moved you to consider it and ponder on it deeply, then you don't really understand it. But there's also a promise contained within this verse. It says, whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. Literally, it says, the wise ones will heed these things. Now, wisdom in the Hebrew worldview is not data. Wisdom is not just gathering lots and lots of information. No matter how much information you may have, that doesn't necessarily make you wise. No, wisdom in the Hebrew worldview is a transformed character through an encounter with the living God. It changes who you are. It changes what you do. And so the psalmist is promising us something here. He is saying, if you ponder on the love of God, if you puzzle over it, if you consider it sufficiently and properly, if you consider it deeply, your life will be changed. Your heart will be transformed. Now that's quite an invitation, isn't it? In fact, the psalm is an invitation for us to do just that. It's a guide for us to do it. You know, over the years, I've often heard people at work say things like, I'm really thankful for my family. I'm really thankful for the home that I have. I'm really thankful for my job and for my friends. I'm really thankful for the good health that I experience. But often what is glaringly missing is who they are thankful to. They may feel that things have worked out as a result of blind chance, or as a matter of luck, or random circumstances. And it all becomes somewhat vague, and it's not directed to anyone in particular. Well, the beginning of this psalm points us toward that missing element. In verse 1, it says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his steadfast love endures forever." And that word forever is an interesting word because it doesn't just mean forever on into the future. It means also forever in the past. It means for all time. In fact, it means beyond time. In verse 2, let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he has redeemed from the trouble, and gathered from the lands, from the east and from the west and from the north and from the south. The redeemed people of God don't render such oblique or ambiguous thanks. For all we are and for all we have and for all we ever hope to be, we give direct thanks to God. He is the source of absolutely everything that is good. Now, originally the summons to thanksgiving was sung by the Israelites to thank God for redeeming them from disaster and from captivity and death. And it provides a rich picture for us of the nature of God's divine work of redemption in redeeming and restoring Israel because of his mercy and because of his goodness and because of this love that is eternal. In verse 3, we have a summary of all of the deliverances that Israel has had in every direction. In Exodus chapters 12 to 14, you can read about how Israel was redeemed from Egypt in the south. In 2 Kings 19, you can see how Israel was redeemed from Syria and Assyria to the north. In 2 Samuel chapter 8, you'll see how Israel was redeemed from the Philistines in the west. Or you could go to the book of Ezra and read how Israel was redeemed from Babylon to the east. So you see, verse 3 was Israel's total experience. They were gathered from lands in every direction, east, west, north and south. And they were summoned to thank God for all of his goodness and all of his mercy and all of his deliverances. The psalm was most likely sung in the congregation of Israel to celebrate these historic deliverances and to remind them about God's ability to deliver them individually from their issues and problems. It was most likely written after the Babylonian captivity had ended, and so they could recite all of the past history of these wonderful deliverances that God provided for them. And seemingly this psalm was used liturgically in worship. Some scholars have even intimated that this psalm specifically was sung at the first Feast of Tabernacles, that Ezra chapter 3 says was celebrated right after they returned from the Babylonian captivity. Now there's a key phrase in verse 2. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Those who have been redeemed are the ones who ought to be praising and thanking God. Those who have been redeemed are the ones that can genuinely sing the song of thanksgiving for God's goodness and God's mercy to them. So even though this psalm deals with Israel on a historical level, you and me, we who are redeemed by God's grace, can join in with ancient Israel and genuinely sing this song. Because we have been touched by God's steadfast and unfailing love. We have been gathered from the four corners of the earth. And so this is our song as well. Now, after this opening call for thanksgiving, the psalm gets very interesting because it provides for us 4 illustrations of God's redemption. First of all, it shows us that God's redemption is like a lost caravan of travellers finding a safe city. And then it talks about God's redemption is like a captive prisoner being set free. And then it talks about God's redemption is like a sick person who is recovering to full health. And then it talks of God's redemption like a doomed sailor being rescued from a deadly storm. And each of these rather poignant and graphic analogies illustrates the blessedness of God's redemptive love for his people. Now, each of these 4 pictures falls into the same pattern. The psalmist follows a specific sequence. First of all, there's the predicament that's outlined. Then there's the petition that's offered. Then there's the pardon that's given. And then follows the praise. The predicament is the dangerous situation described. The petition is the cry for deliverance. The pardon is the merciful deliverance provided in God's love. And the praise, well, that's the call to thanks that follows. Now, our own redemption is imaged in these analogies because we are like people lost in the wilderness who have been brought home. We are like the people that have languished in prison and have been set free. We are those that were languishing in a deadly sickness and have been healed. And we are the ones that were in danger of losing our life on the sea and yet have been brought safely to the harbour. These pictures are not only pictures of Old Testament deliverance for Israel, but of us as well. So let's start with the first picture, being lost in a wilderness. Here's the predicament outlined for us, verse 5, or beginning in verse 4 rather. Some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to a city to dwell in. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. So here we meet these aimless people wandering all over the place with no particular direction in mind, having lost their bearings, not knowing where they're going. They're without resources. They're starving. They're thirsty. They're wandering hopelessly, aimlessly looking for a city that can provide them with food and water. That could well depict the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness when they came out of Egypt, roaming around in the wasteland. It could also be used to describe the plight of Israel in Babylon, lost as a nation, diffused into a pagan culture, into a religious desert of godlessness. But beyond this, it also describes the plight of humanity, destitute, forlorn, lost, wandering aimlessly in the wilderness of sin, spiritually hungry and thirsty, without the spiritual bread of life or water of life, with no hope but to perish in the wilderness. This is what humanity is like without Christ, whether they realize it or not. That is humanity's situation. They wander looking for a city, someplace where there is safety, somewhere where there is food and resources. There is set within the human heart that need. But that's humanity's predicament. But then it leads to petition in verse 6. They cried to the Lord in their trouble. Israel cried to the Lord in Egypt. They cried to the Lord in Babylon. They told God of famished and God.